Donc, je vous parle de cette figure énigmatique.
Speak to you about this particular figure, very controversial figure, but very little known, Miklós Nyiszli, a doctor in surgery and delivery.
L'expression consacrée en français, mais donc le destin est assez unique.
A doctor in
des
obstetrics.
volets que je ne détaillerai pas, le temps est limité.
I will not go into detail, but it's a presentation that aims at being interesting and should give food for a good discussion afterwards. So I'll be at your disposal for questions and remarks after that. A good presentation has to give the content, and then the questions that come afterwards should go into further detail. His history is unique in the history of Sonderkommando. I chose to discuss this case for several reasons. First, I'm 36 years younger than him, but in 1944 I shared the same path of persecution with him. But our train was deviated to Strasov in Vienna instead of following the road to Kassa, Krakow and Auschwitz. And I had also followed the same training as my colleague Vianney in a university in Vienna, where the description of anatomy and legal forensics medicine was taught with the same thoroughness as here in Breslau, where the doctor had followed his training as a doctor and a specialist. Miklós Nyiszli, born in 1901 and dead in 1956, was one of the Arbeitsjuden in Auschwitz with a he was the head of pathological anatomy in Auschwitz, attached to the laboratory of Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he was part of the Sonderkommandos. But he lived with them, he had his meals with him, he slept in the same buildings as they did. Once he was sent to Nagyarod ghetto on the 3rd of May 1944, when Transylvania was attached to Hungary in 1929 in the Treaty of Vienna as a present from Hitler to Miklós. So in 1929 he was locked in these cattle carriages with another 480,000 Hungarian Jews within the framework of the final solution orchestrated by Adolf Eichmann in Hungary, very seriously organized after the organization of the party on 18th of May 1944. Gassing at such a scale had never occurred before or anywhere else. So I'm sending you back to the very detailed work of Braham, the Hungarian Holocaust, published in the United States in 1980, 2 volumes of more or less 1,000 pages that are the absolute authority in this domain. And human life in Adriaos ghetto was reported with a lot of literary detail by de Rojo, a famous writer and miracle survivor of the concentration camp that was probably the largest and the most cruel in the whole of Hungary at its borders at the time. He was personally selected when the train was offloaded by Mengele because of his training and his skills, and from the start he was treated with favors, but he was still part of the Sonderkommando, part of Team 12. He had the basic university training and PhD as forensics doctors and anatomy doctor. So he was therefore the best possible collaborator and assistant for Mengele, and he was part of the morphological section of Mengele, but he was never part of the experiments taking place on dead corpses. So he had to thoroughly describe all the corpses that were brought to him. So he knew exactly the anamnesis, which is what had happened to these victims exactly throughout their life. But he did not raise particular questions about this. He was a very thorough doctor, and he knew that his descriptions, along with the Mengele's comments, were coming to the highest level of the scientific committee of the Reich Institut für Ratzenbiologie und Embryologie in Berlin. He kept a close relationship with the members of the Sonderkommando, but he knew what happened to them after 4 months working for the Sonderkommando. And he knew that this fate could have happened to him at any time in a similar way. Because besides his job as a scientific assistant, as a pathological anatomy doctor, he was also the doctor in charge of monitoring the 4 Sonderkommandos, Team 12, and also its members, which represents 860 potential patients. He was freed after the dislocation of the camp and its medical unit. He was freed in Ebose in early May 1945 and came back to Hungary, and was joined in October 1945 by his wife and daughter, who were rescued thanks to an indirect intervention of Mengele, who made sure his wife and daughter was freed. And in his book, chapters 5 to 35 describe the figures of his wife and his daughter, but very briefly, only twice. But he dedicates a whole chapter, page 100 to 108, to an anecdote explaining how, thanks to the assistance of Mengele, he is rewarded for 3 months of dedicated work, and therefore was rewarded by managing to find his wife in the women's camps, where she was sent to the right of the carriage and sent to the women's section. And because as a doctor he had fantastic skills, he was able to regularly meet up with them and look after their health and feed them. And another SS made sure they would be sent to a military industrial factory away from Auschwitz instead of being executed along with their fellow detainees 2 weeks later. So he started writing his memories immediately after the war and published them first in 1945 and 46 as a novel in the local tabloid at the time that I immediately devoured. I was at the time 8.5 and 9 years old. I was fascinated by this story, and 6 months after my being freed in Vienna, I realized what happened. Because when we were deported for 11.5 months, we didn't officially know about Auschwitz. We didn't know Auschwitz existed. We only found out later through my grandmother, who had to go to hospital in Vienna in order to be treated in surgery, and she was told only in January 1945 that there were gassings. So I come back to the doctor. The book came back the same year. It was published the very same year, and was republished 50 years later as a facsimile. So this is the publishing edition that I have from 1995. And a French version has been available since 1961. The title is Doctor in Auschwitz, Médecin à Auschwitz, and published in the collection J'ai lu, number 1266, published in 1966. In Hungarian, it's 65 pages, divided in 3 parts. First, the deportation and installation into the camps. 4 chapters. The second part, Nyiszli, the doctor and prisoner in his daily life in Auschwitz, chapters 3 to 35, and then the epilogue, the death walk he survived, chapters 36 to 41. And chapters 5 to 35 represent 128 pages out of 165 in the Hungarian version. It's a description of a very chronological description, very balanced as a documentary, a very scientific documentary, without any subjectivity. He was visiting Auschwitz with, it seems, total indifference. He takes his distance, and of course we know he is being touched personally, but he doesn't involve subjectivity in his work, and this is clearly a very good self-defense mechanism. The truth in there seems absolutely impeccable, and let's remember that he started writing this book after 18 months after arriving in Auschwitz, and only 5 to 6 months after being freed. And the first part of his history in Auschwitz is dedicated to his medical activity in the wider sense. For example, with the description of the autopsies he carried out, as well as the description of the context of the victims that arrive on the experiment or autopsy table. Oftentimes he describes the fate of these victims, he describes their history, their background, without making any remarks on medical ethics. He also had to carry out autopsies on SS soldiers who died in unclear circumstances or that were committed suicide. He never filled in the box reason for death, because he didn't want to offend his boss. He didn't want to share complicity with the SS doctors, so he filled in a number of cases that seemed to be of public interest, such as the autopsy he carried out with 2 colleagues over 1 week of 150 detainees for dysentery, in order to be able to publish scientific publications of Dr. Mengele. Of course, he didn't sign the article. A lot of space is taken by the twins cases. That was the major concern in terms of scientific study of Dr. Mengele. He dedicated a long study on a 16-year-old survivor who survived a gassing. He managed to take him out of the gas chamber and resuscitate him, and he demanded to Mr. Hausfield to rescue the boy. He didn't manage to, and then another father and his son with congenital disease who had been shot and then killed with all the other Jews detained in this camp after the revolution of 7th of October. So the skeletons of both victims, who had to be cleaned with scary detail, were sent to Berlin in order to be part of the anthropological collections that were supposed to bring evidence of the inferiority of the Jewish race. The Soviet army was already very deep into Poland, and the subjective and medical part represent about half of the book. The other parts of the book that are scattered around it usually are about describing the camp, the massacres, the attitude and the behavior of SS soldiers, the description and assessment of Mengele's personality, as well as the life and work of Sonderkommandos. Each of these topics, partially known and partially little known, would deserve an individualized analysis, but this is more for historians, pure historians, which I'm not myself. From a personal point of view, I'd like to stress that since 1968, no one has really studied these exceptional documents. The only explanation I see is maybe the difficulty of the Hungarian language. I consider that some of the descriptions of mass exterminations are part of the very high-level literary work. In June 1944, there was a massacre because crematory furnaces were unable to process that many corpses. There has been the extermination of the Roma camp, whole barracks where infectious diseases were revealed. There was a quarantine system. One person was infected with infectious disease. The whole barrack was... the people in the whole barrack were killed, even the barrack on the left, on the right, and then in the ghetto of Lodz, in 7 days, the massacre of the Jews in the ghetto, and finally, last but not least, the rebellion of the Sonderkommando in 1944 also means 70 victims within the SS ranks. So, for me, this is really the climax of the book, from a literary point of view, but also from a historical point of view. It's an exceptional document, even though it has already been mentioned many times in specialized literature, and even in seminars such as the one yesterday and today. It's worth pointing out that Mengele was forced to lie down with all the other members of Sonderkommando that should have been killed. But then he was rescued, he was pulled out because he was still needed. Someone said, the three of you, Mitkommen, come with us. And this is how they were not part of the executed group. What can also be added as a very important point is the execution of the third team of the Sonderkommando. The ones from Team 12 were exterminated after the 7th of October, and after the summer 1944, they worked for a month, and they were then executed. They were executed with flamethrowers. The detail found in the book is quite surprising. It's very thorough and very scientific, even when it comes to non-doctors. He examined their personality, their weaknesses, such as corruption, theft, personal enrichment, alcoholism, burnouts, and so on. He looked at them very thoroughly. It seems to be a shrink's analysis. And also, when it comes to Joseph Mengele, from the beginning of the start, he described him in a very positive manner as a very Stakhanovist worker. He's not using this term, I am. He works very thoroughly, with great dedication. He works, he used the word work as if this was a very deserving task. And when he works full-time in the clinic and in the hospital and the research, plus his 4 or 5 hours hours in the lab, it means he works up to 20 hours a day. He considers him as a genius, a bit crazy, but unfortunately bases his science on erratic scientific theories. For me, it's partially understandable, because they were both doctors, they were using the same language. Nyiszli was perfectly bilingual Hungarian-German. They were trained in the same way. They used the same codified language that anatopathological doctors use, and they based their work on a spotless description of medical phenomena. He wasn't a modern experimentator. He was first focusing on morphology, which meant Nyiszli had a key role to play. Everything was described in a very clear style, as an encyclopedia, even when it wasn't dealing with medical problems. The presentation was always impeccable, in a very high-level literary Hungarian, written as a scientific publication, even when it comes to the description of extermination. The SS figures, including the doctors, seem very credible and are depicted with a lot of credibility and a lot of thoroughness. But the one thing that has to be said is that the way he describes the detainees lacks sensitivity and compassion. His book is a purely scientific publication. He doesn't make a deeper analysis that disappears behind his personal fate. His ambivalent attitude cannot be unnoticed by the reader. But he was never asked to justify this after 1945, because he lived behind the Iron Curtain and died relatively early in the summer of 56, so he was 55 when there were a lot of socialist turmoil because of the Hungarian Revolution in 56. Behind the Iron Curtain there was no Jewish problem. Under the Stalinian regime, there was no Jewish problem. It was the socialist world. No one was accused to have massacred the Jews in the Danube Valley. It was a taboo subject as of December 1948. So, the term Jew was replaced by Zionist, and Zionism was a charge, especially in the Slosky trial and the Pauker trial in Romania and the first one in Slovakia. They were both Jewish and charged with Zionism. But what happened between March 44 and May 45 was a total taboo. And on the subject, you should read the Curtis book, Nobel Prize, published in 1942. And this is why Curtis didn't find a publisher in Hungary until 1976, because the subject wasn't worth any interest and wasn't interesting the socialist population. So let's come back to my text.
Vraisemblablement parce qu'il vivait derrière le rideau de fer et il est décédé relativement jeune. Bien que des éditions en français de son ouvrage existent.
After 45, he lived behind the Iron Curtain. And I can tell you that I've never encountered a scientific article dedicated to this very special personality and to the Sonderkommando, not even in Hungarian. And that raises many questions, and we can tackle many of those questions maybe during the discussion after Mr. Bartosik's presentation. But I can already announce one thing. Kastner is another unknown figure. Kastner, together with Nyiszli, is one of the highly disputed Jewish figures. Kastner saved in Strasov about 20,000 Jews, myself included, and some of the and 1,600 Jews were also saved in Hungary because they could pay up the money. Kastner was tried in the 60s. And then subsequently killed by a young man whose father he had forgotten when he saved 1,600 people and put them on the train. So those are two very symbolic Hungarian figures in the Shoah, highly asymmetric, Kastner and Nyiszli. If you have any further questions, I'm available. And another thing you should realize before you raise your question is the fact that Nyiszli came from an extremely integrated, well assimilated Jewish community. A large majority of Hungarian Jews were mainly Hungarians who just happened to be Jews, but they were perfectly assimilated. And that's why they didn't even understand or realize that they could be exterminated. Some people entered in these train wagons wearing decorations and medals from the First World War, assuming that with those medals nothing could happen to them. And that, of course, made them incapable of realizing what horrible destiny was awaiting them up until the very moment when the gas was entering in the room. And when they killed 430,000 people in a single week, of course, none of them will return to testify about this. But Nyiszli analyzed the others under a microscope, and he described his experiences without, however, passing a moral judgment. That's food for thought, food for debate. And there's also a testimonial. Testimonial of an Israeli citizen from 73, Do Pajsikovic, and he was deported 10 days before Nyiszli, from the Munkacs ghetto. Today, Munkacs is in Sub-Carpathia, and that was a region with the highest concentration, the highest density of Orthodox Jews. And when Eichmann and his Hungarian collaborators, József Eindlich and Baki, started to systematically cleanse the different regions, the first train started from Munkacs. From there, they started destroying the Jewish community. And very few people on that train were sent to the right-hand side to go and do forced labor. 90% of them were immediately exterminated. Emil Jacob, who was discussed yesterday, gave a testimonial on the arrival of a train from Munkacs, from Hungary. So this Survovic, one of the rare survivors of Team 12 of the Sonderkommando, gave his his witness deposition on Wikipedia, and he states a Hungarian doctor had to dissect the victims under the guard of SS, etc., etc. So he dedicates 9 lines to Nyiszli. And the whole of his deposition basically corroborates everything Nyiszli states. Now, this was my presentation. Exactly 25 minutes. We're still within time. And now pass the floor to Mr. Bartosik.
It is now for you.